Looking to dip your toes into literary fiction and don't know where to start? I've got you covered with the books I'm going to talk about in this video. Not all litfic books are slow and hard to follow. The books I'm going to talk about in this video perfectly find a balance between the heavier elements of litfic while also continuing to be page turners themselves. I have around 7 books I want to get through in this video. However, what I wanted to start with is a little definition on literary fiction, as well as some books you might have started with because they're so well known and you might have just stopped and given up on the genre. So I'm going to pull up my laptop for the definition. So litfic is a genre of fiction that is commonly known by being set in a realistic setting, and it focuses on very much like real people in sometimes contemporary, so we'll discuss that a bit, believable settings that are seen to be character studies of sorts. So some common elements include they're quite character driven, they have complex themes, they have experimental writing, introspective tones, and they can also contain a lot of social and political themes specifically. So hopefully that helps define the genre a bit from just like what seems to be a broad category of what some people might just say like boring fiction. And it's a very, very vast world out there. First of all, you might have started with some books that are more commonly known, and I'm not trashing these books because they're actually some of my favorites. But as someone who, if you watched my recent video from around 2 weeks ago, my all-time favorite books that go into my childhood era are all like YA fantasy novels. You started maybe with Harry Potter and you just built your way up from there. And if that describes your reading journey, then it is understandable that litfic seems like this whole other world of reading that might be hard to get into. If you do immediate research, there's going to be common books that come up, and they honestly might not be the best place to start. So examples include The Alchemist, which is honestly a classic. However, this book is slow. I'm not even going to sugarcoat it. This is a very slow-paced book. Even though it's thin, it takes a while to get through if it's going to be your first read in this genre. So I really highly would not recommend starting with The Alchemist, though it is an amazing book. The next one is 100 Years of Solitude, which is a classic. I really don't like the cover I have for this book, but that's a whole other pet peeve I'll talk about later. This is magical realism, and it is actually quite, I'm going to say, if you're not familiar with magical realism, it will be very confusing, it will be a hard sell, and you'll just be confused by all the absurdities that seem to be going on in the book. So I also would not recommend starting with it. A few others include an absolute genius project, which is There by Tommy Orange. It's a fantastic contemporary story told about the indigenous communities and First Nation communities in America. However, it is done in like vignettes of sorts, and it is quite like, real life, contemporary, just snippets of people's lives. And I would say if you start with it, I cannot guarantee that you would see the full genius behind that novel, because it can be just quite like mundane, and that's literally the point of it. The last big one I'll mention, which I have many thoughts on and I'll have other videos about this, is that a very well-known author is Murakami. I would absolutely not start with Murakami. That's going to be a very hard sell. He is kind of in that realm of also magical realism and weird literature, and it's like one way to enter for sure the most commonly known translated fictions out there. So Murakami being one of the most well-known authors in coming out of Japan in the Western world. However, his books are weird. Start somewhere else. I'm gonna put it at that. So let's move on now to the recommendations. I will say that my recommendations are going to be more tailored towards my journey as a reader. So very much that like YA genre and fantasy genre into literary fiction. If you started in a place that's more like mystery, thriller, horror, you might actually be looking for more books that fall into the weird lit side. But anything that I do come up with today is going to be like very small, like dip your toes in entry levels to that kind of genre. And if you come from a different reading background, you might be way more open to explore other books in depth. I'm sure there's a million other recommendations, blogs, and videos you can find out there to make those recommendations as well. The books I have today are all very well known, and I think those are for a reason, but I'm hoping I've shortlisted some that make it more easy to understand which are more accessible and easy to consume if you're newer to just like reading about real life and contemporary events. So I'm going to start with my contemporary list, which is a little longer. And the first one is going to be Normal People by Sally Rooney. This book gets extremely mixed reviews, so it is a bit of a risk to recommend it in this video. To give you a brief synopsis, Normal People follows Connell and Mariana, and they grow up in the same small town in Ireland. Apart from that, that's where the similarities end. Connell is a popular guy, Mariana is a girl on the outskirts of the social circles in school, and this basically follows how Connell's mom is a worker in Mariana's home, and they have this small bit of connection that leads them to having conversations outside of school in their everyday lives. And it basically follows a very complex relationship between the characters through numerous years, and that's literally it. So you can see how this is your definition of a litfic plot. It's just following two characters, and that's the only focus. The reason I would recommend this is if you have been like a big kind of romance reader in the past, this does have romance elements, so it can ease you into litfic with the commonality of a subgenre that you like. What I will say is this is your introduction to very flawed characters, and that's the reason why some people don't like this book. It can make you feel very frustrated because of communication problems, but it is done in a way that's not like to forward the plot. It's done in a way as like a character study, so you have to kind of understand that element of like flawed characters in litfic as a way of just exploring life and real people, normal people. Anyway, that's my first recommendation. So my second recommendation is going to be your intro into translated literary fiction. It's a book called Almond, which I read last year, and it's written by a Korean author translated over to English. So this book follows a little boy who is born with a brain condition. I'm going to try and pronounce it. I think it's called alexithymia or something like that. I'm sorry, I'm not a scientist. And basically what this means is that it's very hard for him to feel emotions. I don't know how accurately this novel goes on to describe the full depth of this actual brain condition. However, this novel gives you a very introductory basis into following one character and their experiences as it comes from a childlike perspective. So I think that was a very interesting element if you grew up reading To Kill a Mockingbird in high school. It's similar to those where you look for the perspective and the tones of a child telling the story. The story itself is very heart-wrenching, it's bittersweet, and it explores the dynamics of almost like found family navigating the world, and very much honestly like You're on Your Own Kid vibes from the Taylor Swift song. So let that be a sell if you are a fan. I recommend this because it is what I would say the perfect gateway into weird lit. There's nothing overly squeamish, overly strange and like absurd about the book, but it dips its toes into what you would see in other commonly translated Asian literature. So this would be your gateway to another commonly known book that is also incredibly enjoyable called Convenience Store Woman, which is a Japanese translated book. And I think that within itself isn't even close to the full scheme of weird lit, but that's the step I would recommend. So Almond, Convenience Store Woman, then go crazy and look at the wild world of weird literature out there. Next, we're going over to New Zealand, and I'm going to recommend a book called Greta and Valden. Greta and Valden follow two siblings that live together in New Zealand, and basically it just goes over their complex love lives. They're both just trying to navigate their life, their careers in, I'm going to say their early and late 20s maybe. I don't exactly remember the age range. It follows this very interesting mesh of cultures where the family of Greta and Valden is Maori, Russian, and Catalonian. So there's a lot of interesting cultures mixed in there to create this very fun dynamic, and it's a very funny, laugh out loud kind of book. Why I would recommend Greta and Valden as an introduction to literary fiction is that it's quite lighthearted, even though it continues to explore complex characters and relationship dynamics, especially between family members, but it all ends up very wholesome in the end, so it's just a very enjoyable and heartwarming read. The final book I'll recommend in the contemporary space is Foster by Claire Keegan, so this brings us back to Irish fiction. Claire Keegan is an author that I would recommend solely because she's just an excellent all-around writer, and I do appreciate that her books are quite short and she doesn't really need more words to make a very intricate story. So in Foster specifically, this book follows a little girl who is sent by her father to live with relatives in a farm in Ireland with no clarity as to when she will return home. It follows her kind of living with this family, experiencing the warmth and affection of honestly having proper adults around for the first time, and this beautiful summer of her kind of just almost growing up and blossoming and finding herself as an individual in her otherwise, like in a family where she otherwise came from with like millions and millions of children, with no attention focused on her. This is very similar to Almond, where it is kind of that childlike perspective. However, it is a lot less weird. It's a story that very much focuses on the day-to-days, but the writing element behind it is very poetic and very descriptive. So I would recommend it as a piece to almost enjoy like the written elements more within the literary fiction space. So that's a good introduction with Foster. So those are the 4 books in the contemporary genre. We'll move over to historical literary fiction. This one might actually be easier for anybody who is a big fantasy person, because I find the good balance between litfic and the historical subgenre is that there is an element of world building in there that you would otherwise be more familiar with. The first book is very, very famous. I think it's been around for a while, so many of you may actually have read it, and maybe that'll give you a sense of accomplishment that you have actually read books in the literary fiction genre before. So that is A Thousand Splendid Suns. So A Thousand Splendid Suns is a book that takes place in Afghanistan, and specifically in Kabul. It follows 2 women, one by the name of Miriam and one by the name of Layla. They're born in separate generations, separate situations. So it's very much a representation of 2 different stories being told during an active wartime. It explores a lot of complexities behind, trauma, resilience, and also life before, during, and after the war. So I thought this was a very thought-provoking book about also real life, but in a context that I would be less familiar with. It's one side of story of Afghanistan life, which, we don't honestly hear a lot about here other than what's covered questionably in the media. So I would really recommend this book. In terms of an intro to litfic, I do think that it covers that, again, that complexity behind traumatic events and characters kind of living through those events, but also done in a very fast-paced and consumable way, specifically in this book. For the next book, we're going back to something I would recommend for romance readers, and this is also an extremely popular book that many of you may have already read. It is The 7 Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. So in this book, we follow a Hollywood icon who goes by Evelyn Hugo, and basically it's about her and her glamorous and scandalous life by the title. So it goes through various stages of her life, visiting the different stories of her and her quote-unquote 7 husbands. And it basically starts with her as a young girl building her career and eventually making it to Hollywood. However, I would recommend that specifically writing by Taylor Jenkins Reid as a literary fiction introduction, because she creates these larger-than-life characters and also world building that very much immerses you in this fictional world that feels very much like it would exist in our real world, which I think indicates her talent very well. And she keeps it entertaining in the literary fiction world because of that kind of old Hollywood feel, and along with anyone who needs, some romance to keep their plot alive while reading. The final book I'll recommend was also very popular a few years ago in the Book Talk and BookTube community, and I read it when I was first kind of restarting the hobby of reading, so I think it was very effective in helping getting me there, and that is The Song of Achilles by Madeline Miller. This specifically is a retelling of the story of Achilles, as the title would tell you, so it follows that commonly known Greek mythology, tragedy, and story, so be prepared for tears, as they will be pouring down your face at the end of this book. I would also recommend this as a very easy start into the genre, because this is a very, very intricate character study about these commonly known and commonly studied characters throughout our history of literary studies, but it's done in a way that's almost modernized, and it explores the characters in a completely new way, while also being within itself obviously a mythology retelling. So anyone who grew up reading Percy Jackson and the likes, this will be a really great gateway litfic book for you, because it's just done so in a very familiar environment with familiar characters. I would also say that this book would be a gateway into her next book, Circe, which is, I think it's a bit heavier in terms of themes and topics, a bit less action-packed, but it's a very, very phenomenal book exploring complex female characters, and honestly a very good mythology retelling with strong feminist elements in it. So that would be your next follow-up book for me. So that was some quick coverage into literary fiction books that I think are great places to start within the genre. I think most of these books are quite famous that I recommended, but I do think that's for a reason, because you want to look for books that are appealing to the masses, because those are generally the ones that are more easy to consume, more accessible, and also just like clearly holding the attention of people enough to get on those bestseller lists. And then you can start looking into more of the unique subgenres within literary fiction and start dipping your toes into the wide world out there. There's a lot of other books that I would really like to chat about in this genre that are deeper within the massive pool of books in it, so I'm sure they'll come up in other videos. Hope you enjoy getting started with these books. If you have other similar recommendations, always let me know, because I have been reading a lot of not so great litfic books recently to try and find a favorite, so I'm in desperate need of another killer read, so let me know. Okay, with that, I will see you in the next video. Goodbye.